Well, hey, folks, and welcome to the Rob Breakenridge Show. Great to have you along with us. In this episode, a closer look at the federal government's major project strategy, whether we're actually fast tracking major projects and whether those major projects are going to have a major impact on Canada's economy, bolstering Canada's economic security, and trying to attract some big time investment into Canada at a time where we desperately need it. Now, this weekend, of course, is the Grey Cup. And for football fans, there's the spectacle of the actual game this weekend. But of course, Grey Cup took on some additional political significance here in Canada as the Prime Minister teased the Grey Cup, or Grey Cup weekend, as a potential backdrop for announcing another round of major projects. This comes after the first batch of major projects were announced back in September. So indeed, on Thursday, a few days ahead of Grey Cup, the Prime Minister, speaking in Terrace, BC, did indeed announce a new batch of major projects. Now, from Alberta's perspective, and we'll get into it, it's worth noting that there's nothing specifically here that is located in Alberta, nor is there, as Alberta had been hoping for or asking for, the announcement of a new pipeline project, or at least some indication that a major pipeline project could be part of future major project announcements. But at the same time, clearly the idea is not off the table and is still being discussed. We'll get to that in a second. What we did hear about on Thursday involved, some mining projects in Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick. There's a transmission line project in northwestern BC and into the north. And there's also a new hydro project in Nunavut. But perhaps the project that is going to have the biggest economic impact is on the LNG front. And it builds off what was announced in September, another LNG project getting the support of the Major Projects Office. That's the Ksi Lisims project in northwestern BC. Now, what's interesting and significant about that project is not just all of the economic potential in LNG development and export, but also the fact that you've got significant First Nations involvement in this project. And, putting aside some of the uncertainty around a new potential oil pipeline, I think it's encouraging to finally see, and there would otherwise be, I think, some excitement in Alberta to finally see progress on the LNG front, Canada finally fulfilling some of that LNG potential. So I think the inclusion of this project is encouraging. And like I say, this is probably the one that has the most likely economic impact. Here was the Prime Minister speaking at his press conference Thursday in BC, talking about this specific project and talking about his government's focus on trying to attract investment in LNG.
And to encourage that investment, the budget provides new tax incentives to encourage the world's lowest carbon, I'll repeat, the world's lowest carbon LNG facilities. And the budget also expands the Canadian Infrastructure Bank's ability to support projects like Ksi Lisims LNG. Ksi Lisims comprises a new gas pipeline, a new electricity transmission line, and a new floating LNG export facility. Led by the Niska Nation under President Ava Clayton, Ksi Lisims will become Canada's second largest LNG facility with a capacity to export 12 million tons of LNG every year to new markets. It'll also be one of the world's cleanest LNG operations, with emissions an incredible 94% below the global average, and with the potential to reach net zero by the end of this decade. All while creating thousands of skilled careers and $4 billion contributions annually to our GDP. The federal government has been working closely with the province of British Columbia in the development of this project, most notably through a one project, one review environmental assessment process and associated consultations led by the province. In addition to consulting on the financing of Ksi Lisims, the Major Project Office will also help coordinate timely approvals of all three elements of the project and the related transmission infrastructure that I'll discuss in a moment.
Okay, well, as noted, there was no pipeline project announced at this press conference on Thursday. Nothing in the announcement, nothing in the press release about a pipeline project being at least something that the Major Projects Office was going to look at, something that might get announced at a future Major Projects announcement. But we do know there are talks happening, and it sounds as though, from what we've been hearing this week, that there is progress being made on a memorandum of understanding between Alberta and Ottawa. Now, ultimately, the goal of that would be federal approval of a new pipeline project, but clearly there are things or expectations that Ottawa has when it comes to Alberta and what the federal government might be looking for. So we didn't get anything in the announcement portion, but we did get some answer from the Prime Minister in the media question and answer segment about these negotiations and about what both sides are looking for. Here was the Prime Minister's answer.
Prime Minister, where do negotiations stand with Alberta on the so-called grand bargain? Premier Danielle Smith was hoping to achieve a deal by the Grey Cup on new energy projects. Is that going to happen?
We call it a memorandum of understanding, as does the Premier. Those discussions are going well. I'm personally encouraged by the progress that we're making. There's a few more issues that we're working on ironing out, looking forward to that progress over the course of the coming weeks. This is a very important process for the province, for the country. It's related in many respects to what we're talking about today in terms of some aspects of this are for major investments that will help build Alberta strong, build Canada strong, make us more independent and more prosperous. We want to make sure we're doing it right. I will reference one thing, if I could just bring it back, and then I'll hand it back to you for your follow-up. In terms of, because we're here talking about the Major Projects Office and these big projects, one of the first bits of work that the Major Projects Office is very much engaged in is around the Pathways project and major carbon capture and storage. This is a huge opportunity for Canada to develop a new industry, to have decarbonized oil and gas, and it is part of, very much part of these discussions that we're having with Alberta. How do we move that forward, part and parcel with other aspects?
She wants a new oil pipeline, and she wants your government to eliminate laws she views as inhibiting investment in infrastructure. What are you asking of the Premier?
We're many things, and as I say, it's a productive discussion, meeting minds. We're looking for a major investment that puts, amongst other things, Alberta puts the industry, puts the country in a position for the energy future. And the future of energy, clean and conventional, is low risk. Canada's low risk. It's low cost, and it's low carbon. And you look again at the Ksi Lisims as an example. Top decile, one of the most environmentally sustainable LNG projects. Rightly proud of that. With respect to the emissions intensity of oil and gas, the intention is to get that down substantially. That has been falling. We have the opportunity to do that, and we need to do that in concert, as well as in concert. I'll say one other thing, and we'll pass on. Is making our industrial carbon markets, the tier market in Alberta, work more effectively, and that's an important element for future investment certainty going forward. Thank you.
All right. Well, joining us now for more on today's major projects announcement from the Prime Minister, as well as the bigger picture when it comes to energy development and policy in this country. Very pleased to welcome back to the program here Heather Exner-Pirot, Director of Energy, Natural Resources and the Environment with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, macdonald-laurier.ca. Heather, great to have you with us here.
Great to be here.
In terms of what we heard on Thursday, I mean, I guess it wasn't a big surprise based on what had been leaked or what the government had been telegraphing, but still, did anything stand out to you in the announcement, what was included or perhaps not included?
Well, I guess it was leaked. The one thing that we got a bit more information, so they're holding one thing back, so there'd be a bit of a surprise, was a Northern Western Conservation Corridor. And it had kind of been under the radar that there might be the Northwest Transmission Line, which is actually, in my view, actually good enabling infrastructure. It helps unleash the Golden Triangle, a premium mining jurisdiction, as well as LNG. But we heard that they're also thinking of extending it to Yukon. And also adding a conservation area the size of Greece. So veering a little bit out of our lanes now, also adding conservation areas. So that was interesting. And also mentioning that they may be looking at labor, maybe sequencing labor or helping sort out labor. And again, it's a lot of tasks for this small major projects office, and that's usually the thing that the private sector handles.
So, what does it tell us about what the role or the purpose of this major projects office is? Is it about helping to advance projects where there's a business case, where things are in the works, or is it kind of about government, almost like as an infrastructure project to try to find these pet projects that they think Canada should have?
Well, I think we were all justified in thinking when C5 was passed, the Build Canada Act, that this was about streamlining regulation. And they included in that act in June all sorts of things that they could bypass to help move a project faster. And it's been revealed, and as far as I know, not actually even one of those projects that has been referred to the Major Projects Office has been qualified for this nation building status or has received any kind of regulatory streamline, in fact. And when you look at the projects they've chosen, it doesn't seem to be, private sector led projects that just needed, a little bit of regulatory help. For the most part, these are projects that actually needed public sector funding to get to an FID to get over that finish line.
Right. And I suppose in a policy sense that could be justified, but as you say, that wasn't really laid out as the purpose or the goal of this office.
Well, sure. The government, there's a role for the government to fund some things. Northern Hydro project, of course, that taxpayer base will never be able to afford it. Some defense critical minerals, with graphite or tungsten, I get it. We need that for the defense supply chain. But what was holding this country back, what we had an election, that largely focused on was regulatory streamlining and getting things moving in this country faster. And what the private sector has been saying is, there's great resources or great projects, but I can do it faster and better in a different country. I can get a return on my investment faster. So we thought this was a shortcut to allow the government to approve these projects, get them, shovels in the ground faster. And we haven't seen that yet. And so it is, curious. I don't think the private sector was looking for help with financing. They were looking for help with regulation.
Yeah, and certainly one project where I think there is a strong economic case, and you mentioned LNG, the Ksi Lisims project. Now, this comes on the heels of LNG Canada Phase 2 being mentioned in the first round of announcements. Now, this LNG project again in northwestern BC. What do you see as the potential of a project like this?
Yeah, so that's, that is a good project. It already received, interestingly, approval from the federal government and the BC government in September. So here again is a case of a project that's already been approved. Why I think it's probably on the list is probably to get Indigenous financing involved. It is Indigenous led. There's a pipeline attached. You do want Indigenous nations to be on board. There is a good use case, for government to say, okay, we're going to, fund you guys the equity so that we have your consent on this. So that one makes in that angle, that makes a little bit of sense for me. And if I am being fair, the government has done quite a bit on LNG, rhetorically and in policy and in budget 2025. And so I'm glad to see it. This is a major project and it does need to get to FID. So this one, I can be a little bit gracious on this one for sure.
I think even putting aside all the other questions around this office and the uncertainty around other projects or even the regulatory uncertainty, there's a lot more here. But I think just looking in a more narrow sense, where there's been such frustration over the years about our inability to live up to that potential that we have when it comes to LNG resources and export capacity, to finally see a lot of this coming now finally to fruition, I think that there is that sense of relief there, isn't there?
Well, if you're an LNG or the project's getting picked, there's probably relief, and for some of the smaller projects, you need this government financing, and that's who it's crowding in. But if the goal was to be an energy superpower, if the goal was to double non-U.S. exports, then these aren't the projects, in my mind, that are going to get us there for the most part, other than these big LNG projects. And so again, we've identified, the problem for a decade. There's too much regulatory burden in Canada. And we thought, again, that the Major Projects Office was the main, a tool to address that. And that's not how that tool is being used at all. So then the next question is, well, when are you going to address the regulatory issues?
Have we seen any steps in that direction? Like one example would be the emissions cap, the oil and gas emissions cap, that it appears as though the federal government is backing away from, although that was left a little vague in the budget. But that would be something I think that is seen as an obstacle to investment, maybe something the federal government is prepared to abandon. What does that tell us about any kind of evolution or shift on the regulatory frontier?
Well, we were all waiting for that Grey Cup summit with Alberta Premier Danielle Smith and Mark Carney. We were told it was going to be today or tomorrow. That's obviously now not going to happen. That it will take a few more weeks or however much longer, and that was supposed to address some of these thornier issues of the clean electricity regulations, of the Impact Assessment Act, of the oil tanker ban, of whether a pipeline is going to be on the list or not. And it's still a wait and see. But the problem is it was Carney that raised expectations that we would have this deal, that it was highly likely a pipeline would be on the list, that we'd be building things at speeds we had not built before. And it seems like we're always not meeting expectations. They're always underperforming on these expectations, and money in the meantime, by the way, though, is flowing elsewhere, and that's where the concern is. So yes, they've made some signals on the emissions cap. That's obviously very positive. But when are we going to be decisive about these kinds of things?
As for the idea of a new pipeline itself, and we seem sort of stuck in the cycle where, we're looking for some indication from the federal government about an openness to this. The federal government saying, we want to see a proposal, and we kind of spin our wheels there. There are some steps being taken that Alberta is leading. And we didn't hear any mention, though, of that today, or any indication as to whether it would be federal support. So what's your sense of where things are at right now?
So I think a lot of Albertans will be disappointed, that there wasn't this Grey Cup summit deal that we've all been waiting for, trying to be patient for. And of course, it was Danielle Smith herself that said, you kind of have 6 months to address these things. This is the 6-month mark. And now, maybe it's 7 months to address these things. But I will say, hearing through the grapevine, secondhand sources, that do seem to be still talks, that they do seem to be appearing to be in good faith, that the tone is very different with the Carney government, with the Trudeau government, and that talks are still proceeding. And there's still some optimism that some good things will come forth. And I think you will see Danielle Smith, kind of still let's wait and see. We're still waiting. There's still negotiations. But we're all kind of, getting antsy to see what are those actually going to mean.
It's interesting, too, in the context of all of this. I know you were posting about it this week. Some interesting forecasts when we look longer term about oil demand. And I think this is relevant in terms of Canada's position here. And what do we need in terms of infrastructure and production in the years ahead, with previous thoughts or, certainly maybe expectations that we're kind of closer to a peak. Not so much anymore. That long term, looking toward 2050, there's still growth in demand, isn't there?
Well, and then this is new from the International Energy Agency, coming like a bomb, I will say, during COP30, to say that actually, there isn't peak at 2030 like it had suggested last year. But even on current policies, we're looking more at 2050, which is to say we don't see a peak in sight. We can't predict when a peak won't happen. And I think the oil and gas sector in Alberta and the Alberta government always believed that. I think the Trudeau Liberals did believe that there was a peak, and that they could block our oil and gas because no one was going to need it anyway. So it wasn't actually doing us any harm. Now I think it's clear that we are going to need that oil, and the sector's, looking to fill it. And you can see Enbridge, in all the quarterly reports in the past week, Enbridge saying they want to expand their main line up to 400,000 barrels, which isn't far off from what Trans Mountain was, which is 590,000 barrels. CNRL saying that, they're working on some early stage projects, which could be up to 340,000 barrels, $15 billion of projects. It was interesting to me, Rob, that these are not the sorts of things that are making it to the major projects office. They're not the sort of things that need government funding. They're the sort of things that have asked the government for an easier regulatory system, a more clear regulatory system. And those projects still haven't gotten it. But the business case for Canadian oil is just so good. And I guess they see the writing on the wall.
Well, between projects like that and potentially expanding Trans Mountain as well, I think, sort of medium term, maybe that would address some capacity needs. But does that in any way impact or even negate the case for a new pipeline? Where does that fit in alongside these other kinds of projects?
Well, I guess it's good that we have breathing room, political breathing room, because it looks like it will take a few months for this to be sorted. But so we do have, you could have up to 700,000 barrels based on what Trans Mountain has said, based on what Enbridge has said, of just expanding existing lines, which is obviously easier to get consent and regulatory approval for. But we know how long it takes to build a greenfield pipeline in this country. We know, 5 or 6 years would be wildly successful, would be optimistic. And we know that extra, egress that, Enbridge and Trans Mountain may add will be up in 6 years. So by 2031, we'll be staring at the end of a barrel again. Hopefully it's a pipeline barrel instead of a shotgun barrel. And that is why there's some urgency. And that is why it is good that the Alberta government has, started its technical advisory committee, because it will take 2 or 3 years to do the consultation, to talk to the communities, to settle on a route, to get the political social license, frankly. But that job needs to start now so that we can actually be putting oil through it, by 2031.
Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done, but as you say, I mean, now's the time to do it, right? Because you got to do all that planning now if you want to have some kind of realistic timeline for realizing a project like that.
Well, and American money is starting to kick tires in the Canadian oil patch as the Permian looks a little less attractive. They've gone through their best reserves. That money wants to go somewhere, and we anticipate that prices should turn around at the end of 2026 and probably look pretty good at by 2030. And we know that Canada has those very long life reserves. So this is the time where you would want to have a pipeline in the queue, so that companies know that there will be growth. If you put money into a Canadian oil company today, you will get that return on investment. It will turn into growth. It will turn into production. It will eventually get to markets. And so that's the kind of signal that you would hope a prime minister who wants to make us an energy superpower would be giving. And that's why maybe it's dismaying, is that, we still don't really know where he stands on an oil pipeline. We still don't really know what direction they think it's going to go. It's been 6 months into this government's mandate. And I think it's time that we know what's happening.
Yeah, and in terms of how the environmental policy ties into this, we mentioned the uncertainty around the emissions cap. Probably, it looks as though they're prepared to move away from that, but wanting to strengthen industrial carbon pricing, a real emphasis then with that, I guess, on carbon capture too. So, how much more certainty then do we need, even if there is a potential green light for a pipeline? What's the impact of policy uncertainty moving forward?
Well, it's no one. You have to appreciate the oil sands companies. The majors are all publicly traded, and so they have to make decisions in line with what the market, expects and wants. And if they're making decisions that aren't going to result in returns, if all their profits get plowed back into a carbon capture pipeline, investors will simply, move into other sectors, either other companies, other oil companies that don't have to do that, or simply other sectors. And so they have to be competitive. They have to have a competitive rate of return. And at $60 WTI, it's hard for me to see the business case. It's hard for me to see any of those companies' boards approving FIDing a $16.5 billion carbon capture pipeline. So the question, why we're still negotiating, why we don't have a resolution, is someone's got to pay for that. It's very expensive. Is it, are we going to put all our eggs in a very expensive pipeline? Are there other ways that we could get there that are maybe a bit more incremental, maybe a little bit less risky, diluents and solvents and that kind of thing, other process improvements? And that's what, and they started to call it Pathways Plus. And I wonder if they're putting all their eggs in the Pathways pipeline capture, basket, or if pipelines or Pathways Plus is a way to say there's more than one way to skin a cat. All we want really is emissions reduction, and we'll work on you on a way to get it that also makes Canadian oil companies competitive.
So, assuming we're close to a memorandum of understanding here between Alberta and Ottawa, and all signs point to at least some progress being made. Now, we don't know the specifics of it, but do you think that alone, or that would be enough to give some investors certainty, to be a positive signal in and of itself?
Listen, I will give some credit because they've already done it on LNG. And the tonal shift on LNG in the last 6 months, Carney literally going to Asia, I'm certain having, backroom conversations. We want your investment. We're going to be a safe place to invest. And even David Eby going there and saying they want LNG. That has made a difference, if you ask me. That has given, Asian investors who had to spend billions of dollars on these projects some confidence. And we saw literally 18 hours after the budget was announced that Petronas, Malaysian natural gas importer, signed a 20-year deal with Pembina on the Cedar LNG. So investors are hearing it. And imagine if they could give the same kind of indication on oil. Imagine the investment that we could see come to this country. Imagine how we could fulfill kind of that energy superpower promise if they gave the same indications on oil. And that's what I'm really, really hoping for, that they can work it out. Because, again, you want to do all these things, be the fastest growing G7 economy, be that energy superpower, double your exports. There's one way, the fastest, easiest way to do that in Canada is to expand your oil exports.
We'll see what more we hear in the days and weeks ahead. Much more is mentioned. Macdonald-Laurier.ca. Heather, appreciate your insights as always. Thank you so much for joining us here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right. Well, our thanks once again to Heather Exner-Pirot, again, Director of Energy, Natural Resources and the Environment at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And we'll indeed see what the government has in store in terms of future major projects announcements. But also, I think it's really important to demonstrate at some point here where we're actually seeing progress, meaningful, tangible progress on some of the projects that have already been announced. So this is about fast tracking those projects. You should be able to show Canadians, say, see here, it's happening. So I think that's also going to be important for the federal government. Yeah, obviously there's a lot of interest here in what happens between Alberta and Ottawa and a potential memorandum of understanding to be able to move forward on a new pipeline project. So we played for you what the Prime Minister said at his Thursday news conference, indicating that progress is being made. Maybe the two sides are close. Now, interestingly, we haven't really heard anything as of this recording late Thursday afternoon from Alberta's Premier. Now, Heather mentioned it in the conversation that, we are hearing that potentially there could be a summit or some kind of meeting between Carney and Smith to discuss this further, maybe the potential for some kind of breakthrough, which perhaps would explain why we haven't heard anything from the Premier. Now, it is also interesting to note that the Premier is set to speak on Friday. The Premier is scheduled to appear at a noon press conference on Friday, but that's a press conference involving a healthcare announcement. So it's had nothing to do, at least on the surface, with the major projects announcement or any potential memorandum of understanding with Ottawa. I would imagine and expect that there will be questions for the Premier about Carney's announcement on Thursday, about Carney's remarks on a memorandum of understanding, and to certainly get the Alberta Premier's perspective on where things stand. So maybe a little bit more clarity on some of that on Friday. But I think ultimately, if there is going to be an announcement of a memorandum of understanding or some kind of breakthrough, that would be its own standalone press conference. Understandably so, that would be a pretty big deal. The other issue, by the way, and I wanted to touch on this on the podcast here, and I would imagine the Premier is going to be asked about it at the press conference on Friday, is this whole issue of voter recall, which does, I guess, tie in with the whole issue of citizens' initiative. Because these are the two direct democracy tools that the Alberta government has given Alberta voters. Legislation that began under Jason Kenney came into effect when Danielle Smith was Premier. And in fact, since becoming Premier, Danielle Smith, of course, has made it easier to do both of those things. Launch a petition to get a question on a referendum, or to launch a petition to get a politician, which could be a city councillor or an MLA, recalled from office, basically removed from office. Now, with growing frustration in Alberta on a number of issues, opponents of the government or critics of the government are now starting to try to use these tools against the government. And so there's a few things going on here. One of them, first of all, is whether Elections Alberta has the resources to manage all of this. Now, it was early last week, before an all-party legislature committee, the chief electoral officer was basically pleading for some additional resources, about $13.5 million. To manage all of this, all these different petitions, or potentially planning for referendums or recall votes. And the UCP majority on that committee used that majority to whittle that request down to barely a tenth of what he was asking for, just over $1.4 million. So as it stands right now, the chief electoral officer and the staff at Elections Alberta, now we spoke to Thomas Lukazik recently about his petition that they've submitted for verification. That's over 456,000 signatures that need to be verified. There's also the petition that's been issued, and we talked about that recently on an episode of the Line Alberta podcast, a referendum on private school funding in Alberta. So at some point, those signatures are going to come back. They'll need to be verified. And who knows what else might arise. In fact, interestingly, on Thursday, the Alberta Federation of Labor put out a press release, and they're really trying to push back on the government, certainly in the way they handled the teacher strike and using the notwithstanding clause. They want to launch some petitions to put some questions to a referendum, questions around using the notwithstanding clause, one question on minimum wage, another on the Canada pension plan. So those petitions could be in the works. That's just on the citizens' initiative side. On the recall side, we've now got 2 petitions that have been approved by the Chief Electoral Officer, one targeting the Education Minister and Calgary MLA Demetrius Nicolaitis, and another targeting Airdrie East MLA Angela Pitt. Now, we understand there's some other recall campaigns in the works. There's, in fact, kind of a group or a coalition of groups calling themselves Operation Total Recall. And so basically, they're going to be trying to target a number of UCP MLAs. And I guess the thing to keep in mind here is that the UCP is only about 3 seats above the majority threshold in the Alberta legislature. So yeah, losing some MLAs could put their majority government in jeopardy. Now, by the way, it's not so easy to recall an MLA, and there are a number of steps before that actually happens, and it's worth noting how the process works. Now, first, you got to do the petition side of things, and that's 60%, a total representing 60% of the amount of votes that were cast in that riding in the last election, which is a bit of a change because before it was 40% of all total eligible voters. So this actually makes it a little bit easier, but you got 90 days to do that. And that was expanded from 60. So if that succeeds and you get enough signatures, and that's all verified, there would then be a recall vote, which is a yes-no question. Do you want this MLA or politician recalled? And if the answer is yes, then they're removed, the seat's vacant, there would be a by-election. So there's some steps to go through, and it's entirely possible that even if a specific MLA is recalled, that the party might still be able to hold on to that seat in a by-election with a different candidate, or presumably maybe the same candidate could still try to get back in somehow. Anyway, there are a few steps to go through there. And there's no criteria for why you would recall somebody or legitimate reasons why you would launch a recall petition. It's pretty much here's when you can do it in terms of after the last election, before the next one, and here's how to do it. And that's it. Right. And it should be noted, too, people probably recall last year, the first real manifestation of that, these rules, was a recall campaign targeting then Calgary Mayor Jyoti Gondek. And it didn't succeed just because the threshold was so high, doing a citywide recall of a mayor, but it did generate a lot of interest and a fair amount of support. In fact, the organizer of that petition actually got elected as a city councillor in the recent election. So he certainly gained some profile or some notoriety from all of that. But again, nobody in the Alberta government objected to that petition campaign. It was basically, we don't think Jyoti Gondek's a good mayor. We don't like what she's doing. We don't like her priorities. We want her out of there. And there was nothing in the legislation that said that was illegitimate or an unfair basis. Now, look, there were supporters of Jyoti Gondek that didn't like that. Fair enough. But the Alberta government had absolutely no objection to that campaign. And by the way, it was right in the midst of that campaign is when Danielle Smith announced, hey, we're going to make it a little bit easier to do all of this. So it's really rich now for the Alberta government to be claiming, as we've heard from the Premier herself and some of these other targets or potential targets, that this is all unfair, that this is in bad faith. And the Premier suggesting this is, people trying to topple her government. Again, I mean, there should be zero sympathy for the government here. They're the ones that created these rules. They're the ones that set up this process. They're the ones that did so without any guidelines or parameters on reasons why you might do this. Basically, if you're unhappy with the government or elected officials, here's one option you have at your disposal. So it should be no surprise the people that are frustrated with this government are taking advantage of that. And so the government created this monster here, and now they're frustrated or upset that it could turn on them. But I'm not sure why they didn't factor that in when they did this. Part of it, I think, was that it was kind of targeting their own base, in terms of who wanted this. And this was maybe sold to small C conservatives, a way to keep left-wing politicians in check if they managed to somehow get elected in a conservative province. And the people that were objecting to voter recall were maybe typically those on the left. They weren't too crazy about it. So I don't know if the Alberta government, convinced itself that, well, the left doesn't like this, so therefore they will never use it. Clearly, that was naive. So this is the process that exists. The people that are involved are following the process as it's laid out. They're not doing anything wrong. They're certainly not doing anything inappropriate or illegal. They're following the process. So the Alberta government doesn't like it, but they made this bed, right? And they're the ones that need to lie in it here. It's a little unfortunate, though, that they're maybe just out of pettiness or frustration that they're not providing Elections Alberta with the resources they need to manage all of this, that they maybe prefer things descend into chaos, or the elections officials get bogged down and they can't process all of these requests. That's not a mature or responsible way of responding to all of this. I mean, if you believe in direct democracy, and look, governments have all kinds of reasons for not liking it, which is why you don't see it very often. But if this government believes that direct democracy is a tool Albertans should have at their disposal, then back that up and say, look, here's what Elections Alberta needs. It's not free to do this. Petitions, verifying petitions, referendum campaigns, by-elections, recall votes, that all costs money. If you don't think this is worth the cost, then scrap the legislation. But again, you knew that when you brought it in. So it's shaping up to be maybe a chaotic few weeks or months here as all these various petition campaigns go through the various stages. Elections Alberta tries to manage all of this, and maybe presumably at some point we'll have referendums or recall votes that all or some of us will be engaging in. But again, this is all under the process that the Alberta government was convinced that Alberta needed. And I think critics at the time warned that this is what it can look like, that this can be weaponized, as some said at the time. And interestingly, now that's a term that some of the UCP have picked up on. I don't really understand the meaning or the context of that word and all of this. Voter recall is a tool that's available. There's a process that's laid out. I guess you could call it a political weapon of sorts, but it's an entirely legitimate one to use, at least according to the Alberta government. So again, we'll see if the Premier has any more to say about this, all of this, when she's asked about it. Presumably, I would expect that she would at this press conference on Friday. I have a piece that should be up soon, shortly, maybe already is by the time you're hearing this, at The Line Alberta, alberta.readtheline.ca. And I suspect we'll hear a lot more on this issue in the weeks and months ahead. So anyway, that's where we will leave it for this edition of the Rob Breakenridge Show. Again, our website, robbreakenridge.ca. You can find this podcast on your regular podcast platform, Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcast, and don't forget our YouTube channel as well, Rob Breakenridge Show at youtube.com. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Rob Breakenridge. We will talk to you next week. Take care. Hey, folks, thanks for watching and listening. You can find us at robbreakenridge.ca. Also, make sure you hit that subscribe button below and stay connected with the Rob Breakenridge Show.